Hey everybody, welcome to The Bottom Line. Michael Noland here, and tonight we're going to take a look at the Beatles' very first album. That, of course, is the album called The Beatles, Please Please Me, with Love Me Do and 12 other songs. Okay, so I agree, not their most artistically entitled album, but more on that in just a moment. So the first thing I wanted to talk about tonight in regard to the Beatles' first album is that of their junior status still at this point. You have to remember, at the time of the February 11th of 1963 recordings for the album, 4 of the 14 tracks were already in the can. These were the 2 tracks from their first 2 singles. Of course, their first single, Love Me Do, only charted to number 17 in England at this time. A huge move forward, though, for the band. And even the song Please Please Me, with a much improved Beatles sound, only charts at this time to number 2. So for EMI to even consider offering a long player, in other words, an LP, to the Beatles, who were at this point anywhere from 20 to 22 years old, wasn't so much an act of faith by EMI as it was, let's go ahead and cash in on this group before the bottom drops out. But with Brian Epstein having a firm understanding with their brand new producer, George Martin, and his assistant, Norman Smith, it was the intention by George Martin at this point to reproduce in the studio the Beatles' live act. There was even some discussion of recording the album live at the Cavern. But after George Martin looking into the recording conditions that existed at the Cavern, he decided wisely at this point to go ahead and bring them in to EMI. It's here on this album that the Beatles establish a temporary rule of sorts. You see, it's with this album and their following album where they agree to write 8 of the songs with 6 covers. The songs on this album that aren't written by the Beatles are a fair representation of the type of material that the Beatles had learned to cover, not only in Germany, but locally there at the Cavern, as well as them achieving a bit more sophisticated sound as they did the theater circuit there in England. Now, before we get too much further into the album, there's one point I'd like to bring out. Take a listen to Paul McCartney's bass playing on this album. Now granted, the low end isn't as present even on the new mixes. This was their first album, and they would continue to be frustrated with the lack of bass response in Paul's bass guitar. But his playing on this album, with very few exceptions, heralds the bass player that he would eventually become. Really, at this point in time, you've got to remember, most artists weren't necessarily musicians. Many of them merely supplied the vocals to songs they never even wrote themselves. Most artists would come in and do the vocals on songs that their management would give to them, and very few of them were actually accomplished musicians on top of that. But I will compare Paul McCartney's bass playing with that to any top 10 song in 1963 in the United States. Now, the reason I make this statement is I actually listened to top 10 songs recorded in 1963. And with the exception of American bass sounding much more rich, much deeper, the actual bass playing on this album sounds like it's coming from a studio musician who had been there several years, maybe 26, 27 years old, not 21. Like Paul McCartney. And it's on this album that him and Ringo really develop a sound. Paul getting intricate when Ringo allows it. Ringo filling in hi-hat rolls when Paul steps back and allows that to come to the fore. Almost all of the Beatles' actual performances on this album shine. But it's at this point that I hear a world-class bass player. And at that time in England, only the Shatters were as good a musicians as the Beatles were. And you can tell by listening to these tracks, Paul's been listening to their bass player. But with Please Please Me, they spent hours. No, I'm serious. They spent actually whole groups of hours recording this album. Sgt. Pepper Sessions, almost 6 months. Please Please Me, less than 13 hours at about 12 hours and 45 minutes. Now it's true at this point the Beatles did have 4 of the 14 tracks already in the can at this point, but the Herculean task of recording 10 songs in a single day, where engineers need a single day just to turn on the equipment in studios these days, the Beatles surprised even George Martin at this point. He made the comment that he just couldn't believe it. They were like a machine. The more that he threw at them, the more they could accomplish. So just like Neo being fed kung fu programming, George Martin threw at the Beatles everything he could think of during this less than 13-hour period. Starting at 10 o'clock in the morning, ending at 10:45 p.m., the Beatles finally managed to record an entire album in a single day. Now, when you think about this, you have to remember John Lennon was ill at this time. He was in the middle of an extremely bad cold. He had been supplying lead and backing vocals all day, and it's at this point that they have one song left to do, and that, of course, is the powerful Twist and Shout. George Martin knew this song taxed John's voice even under the best conditions. Paul notes that John had been sucking on Zoobs all day to coat his throat so that he could attack each and every vocal, whether it was lead or backing. Quite literally, in the last minutes of the last hour of recording this album, John Lennon made 2 attempts at recording the lead vocal of this song. Amazingly, it's his very first attempt that he nails, and it's that very first attempt that is on the album that we know today. This is not only a rarity in recording, but it certainly is a rarity with newbies in the studio. But you see, this is what I want to bring out about the Beatles. The Beatles to EMI must have been just a bunch of newbies. EMI didn't have a lot of faith in the band. They didn't know that they had one of the most professional groups they could ever have imagined to have signed. These young men grew from a group of boys in a skiffle group over a period of years, achieving a new level, one rung at a time. And as far as I'm concerned, they continued this upward mobility all throughout their career. Now you have to understand, this is a full year before America would even get a hint that the Beatles existed. But in England, Beatlemania was already the rage. And it took EMI by storm when this album became #1 and stayed on the charts for an amazing 30 weeks. This kind of staying power had a lot to do with getting certain American entities interested in the Beatles. Now, it wasn't uncommon for long play LPs to be quite good sellers for more established acts. Ella Fitzgerald, Frank Sinatra being only 2 who not only experimented with the LP, the long player, but even made some artistic choices and were creating sounds for each LP that they were putting out. But for a pop group, especially with the eldest being only 22 years old, given an LP in England at this time is not only a clear indication that George Martin knew what he had, that Brian Epstein knew what he had, and that if EMI as an entity were slightly confused by the Beatles, they as a team would let EMI know that these young men were here to stay. Even in these first recordings, there are some overdubs. The entire album was recorded on a 2-track machine. But even at this early stage, the Beatles had learned how to do some overdubbing. Here they would overdub keyboards with George Martin, establishing himself as a backup keyboard for the Beatles whenever they needed him and his style of playing. And of course, they were thrilled with the idea of being able to overdub hand claps. On their next album, they would go overdub crazy. But here we can see that the Beatles right off were taking advantage of studio trickery. But soon the world would come to expect the Beatles to do this with almost anything they touched. Need a new #1 hit? No problem. We'll knock a couple off for you in the next week or 2. Need 7 songs for a movie? No problem. We'll write that up on the weekend. Time for a new album? Guess John and I gotta get to work. The fact that the Beatles made a career of making everything look easy doesn't take away in the slightest the fact that these four young men were geniuses. The fact that this album sold so well at a time that it was thought teenagers wouldn't pay this kind of price for the products. And the absolute fact that they wound up not only doing so, but doing so pretty much in mass. As far as weeks on the chart, this is the Beatles' biggest selling album. They would sell more album units later on, but in 1963 England, 30 weeks at number one was an amazing feat.